Good afternoon. My name is Colette Watson, and welcome to Free Press Live. Free Press Live is brought to you by Free Press, a nonprofit, nonpartisan media reform advocacy organization. And each week, we're your source for updates and live discussion of what's happening in the world of communications rights. You can learn more about our work at freepress.net. Today, we're going to discuss the media's role in anti-Black racism historically and today. And we're joined by a special guest, Tia Oso, as well as a contributor from the Free Press team, Tauhid Chappell. But first, the headlines. Last week, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Prometheus Radio Project versus FCC, a case that public interest groups brought against the agency in response to the FCC's 2017 order that gutted long-standing media ownership limits. The court deferred unanimously to the Trump FCC in a decision that will lead to even more media consolidation. Justice Brett Kavanaugh led the court in affirming the FCC's actions on judicial deference grounds. A concurring opinion from Justice Clarence Thomas asserted that the FCC had, quote, no obligation to consider minority and female ownership, a statement showing a stunning indifference to the disproportionate impact this ruling will have on Black-owned and controlled media in the United States. In response, Media 2070 Director Alicia Bell released the following statement. Today, the Supreme Court affirmed the Trump FCC's effective exclusion of the Black community from greater media ownership opportunities with its decision to rubber stamp the weakening of local ownership limits. This decision is just the latest in a steady tide of deregulation since Congress ended the FCC's Minority Tax Certificate program in 1995 and passed the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which paved the way for massive media consolidation. These measures have decimated Black media ownership, leaving in its wake a rise in racist right-wing disinformation via talk radio, cable news, internet platforms, and beyond. So we'll be continuing to watch the results of that Supreme Court ruling. But today we're focusing on media's role in perpetuating anti-Black racism and how media power impacts the ability to have our society shaped by diverse voices. Again, we have special contributor Tauhid Chappell, who's working on an exciting project in Philadelphia that could transform the way newsrooms work. Welcome, Tauhid.
Hello, Colette. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure working with you every day and, of course, having you here on Free Press Live. And I also want to welcome Tia Oso, who's Director of Communications for the Action Center on Race and the Economy, better known as ACRE. Tia is a transformational organizer and strategist for over 10 years, a very just renowned social justice leader and a great friend. Tia, welcome to Free Press Live. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Colette. Hey, good to see you again, Tauhid.
Wonderful. So, I'm going to dive right on in. We've been working to advance the Media 2070 Media Reparations Project here at Free Press. Tia, you've been integral in that project. Tauhid, as you are as well, part of that team, or as you like to call yourself, the official hype man for media reparations. But for folks who are watching and may not know, the Media 2070 Project has a vision of transforming who has the capital and the power to tell our own stories 50 years from now, not waiting until then, but building that world as we speak. And so as part of that, we, of course, look at media ownership as well as narrative control as a big part of shaping the media and also understanding its historical harms against the Black community and perpetuating the myth of Black inferiority. So I want to turn to you first, Tia. When we think about systemic oppression, we often talk about criminal justice or the criminal legal system, really, or the education system or even healthcare. But the Media 2070 Project is inviting folks to think of media as a system too, and one that has anti-Blackness in its DNA from the very beginning. But Tia, I want to ask you, when you think of media anti-Blackness, what immediately comes to mind, and what does that harm look like in today's world?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, Colette. And even in preparing for this conversation, the first thing that this kind of framing in this question made me think of is Birth of a Nation being like the first major motion picture that was screened in the United States. Like the power of media is both about not just sharing information, but telling stories and narratives that help us make sense of the world. And in the United States media has been used to, criminalize and vilify Black people, like it's rooted in anti-Blackness. And then, when Black people were able to start our own media, we used it, right, as a tool for survival and as a resource to help, tell our own narratives. It makes me think about Ida B. Wells in the anti-lynching campaign. So I think that it's really important for us to understand that the role of media, as a structure and as a system in our society, both to advance narratives as well as to perpetuate those narratives and who they're in favor of. We can't emphasize enough the role that it has played and continues to play in all other intersecting issues in this country, including the economy, including race, including gender justice, all of these different things. And, our corporate media as well as local independent media, right, reflects the anti-Black bias. And until we're able to actually reckon with that, we're not going to really be able to undo these systemic structures of oppression.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tia. I know also, Tauhid, that you have done a lot of work in the area of marijuana legalization, for instance, and examining the historic role of the media in the war on drugs. So when I'm hearing Tia talk about, how media intersects with so many issues, I think what I'm hearing is that media shapes our ideas of what is true, what is real and what is valuable, and shapes the conditions in which policy is made, whether it be drug policy, healthcare policy, infrastructure, and actually really impacts all of our lives in that way, creating those conditions of culture. Tauhid, I know right now you're working on a project with the Philadelphia Inquirer, which faced some pretty strong demands for change last year in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and in the midst of the continuing global uprising for Black lives. What happened at the Philadelphia Inquirer, first of all, and how does it connect to larger protests regarding George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and state violence against Black lives?
Yeah, last June, I believe, in 2020, really as the uprisings were continuing and continuing to amplify and grow globally, the paper of record within Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Inquirer, displayed a broad, massive headline that was shared online and in the newspaper that said "Buildings Matter Too." And it's, you can only imagine just the anger that created, not just within the public that read that, but also within the journalists of color and the Black journalists that had to see that headline displayed and shared and distributed to the masses. Buildings Matter Too. It is just a further reinforcement on how many of our media institutions that still exist today seem to value and place more importance of property over Black lives. And the column that had really been associated with that particular headline was from an architecture writer who basically talked about how the looting and the destruction of property in Philly was basically a negative look on the city as a whole, and that the property destruction was not helping really discuss the issues around police violence and helping people push the narratives around Black Lives Matter and all that. So, seeing how property is still upheld as something that is necessary to protect and to ensure that it is not destroyed over Black lives, it just reinforces the fact that the media has always painted Black lives as something that is not valuable, that is not dignified, that is not human or part of humanity in my eyes. And I really wanted to briefly dovetail of what Tia had mentioned too, just about, the ongoing reinforcement of how the media paints Black lives. There's a headline that I point people to that isn't that far ago. This was from the New York Times in 1914. The headline says, Negro cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace. Murder and insanity increasing among lower class Blacks because they have taken to sniffing since deprived of whiskey by Prohibition. This is by the New York Times, only in 1914. And that wasn't really that long ago. So this is just an ongoing cycle reinforcing to the public, to white audiences and white readership too, that Black lives are not something that are valued, that Black people are a menace, and that the destruction of property, the looting, the destruction, the burning is something that needs to be protected and saved. And yet Black lives don't get that same level of value or respect. And so when Buildings Matter 2 headline published in Philly, that created an uproar. You had journalists of color specifically holding a digital sick out where they basically stopped working for the entire day in protest, saying that not only was that headline ignorant and racist, but that really just underlines the racism within that institution. And then on the outside, the work that we've been doing here at Free Press, which is trying to transform how journalists cover crime, police, and the criminal legal system while elevating and centering the people with lived experiences and those that have been harmed directly by police violence and state-sanctioned violence. We were able to organize more than 40 social, racial, and media justice organizations to call on the Inquirer to completely change its culture and transform how it actually serves Black audiences in Philly. Because a headline like Buildings Matter 2 does not do anything other than put more Black lives in danger.
That's right. Thank you, Tauhid. And I want to let our viewers know that you actually wrote on this very topic for generosity.org, and that link is available in the comments. But absolutely, the media system has endangered Black lives from the beginning and even profited from Black pain in many ways to make itself viable. I want to give you a chance to respond, Tia. I saw you shaking your head vigorously. Did you want to get in here?
Oh, yeah, just like the idea of a headline talking about Buildings Matter too. One of the things that whole kind of framing is making me think about is the both sidesism that we've experienced, like since the, since the initiation and like the complete, the resurgences of Black Lives Matter. There's always a way that in mainstream media, and not just mainstream media, there's a white idea that there's sides. And so there's like the police doing their job on the side, and then Black people that are angry that the police are doing their job and a life was lost on the other side. And that, rioting or protesting or cursing at a protest or just being angry or stopping traffic is something that's not helping the quote unquote cause, as though there are people who are better served by Black people being killed extrajudicially. And that framing in and of itself teaches audiences, all the audiences that consume the media, it teaches audiences that they have to pick a side, right? Because of that framing, that dichotomy. And it's very, it's number one, it's false and it's very disingenuous, and it vilifies people who are standing up for their human rights. And even though, this last kind of round of protests last summer in spring had, some of the largest impact, some of the widest reach, still the way that it was covered in the media is meeting the question of whether or not the sanctity of human life should be honored very dubiously and very skeptically. And I know within, as I studied journalism in undergrad and being, in the communications work field, there's a way that is positioned as being objective and necessary, even though we're literally talking about people being killed in cold blood. And so I think that not only is it necessary for us to question those structures, it's necessary for us to question the mindset and the framework behind it, and to call it anti-Blackness, and to call it, racist, to call it, white supremacist, because that's what it is. And there's even a conversation around, if you call something white supremacist, now am I evil for calling this person racist and, calling out their race? Now I'm not being objective. Is really ludicrous, because what we're talking about is, like how you said, you're putting people's lives in danger. by framing the issues the way that you're framing them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tia. It is a matter of life and death. And I know, Tauhid, that is why you are actually helping to pilot some major changes or major ideas at the Philadelphia Inquirer in partnership with community, as well as with journalists who've been advocating for change within that institution. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about what's happening with that project?
Yeah, so after the headline came out and the response was the response that the Inquirer faced, they actually partnered with Temple University to do a extreme audit of their sourcing, their culture, their policies, their partnerships, anything and everything they can do to kind of look at not only was this one instance of failure up and down the newsroom that this happened, what are other instances of racism and how that influences our news gathering process and the eventual news product that we distribute. And so after Temple University, they had professors do all sorts of interviews, help them figure out different types of sorting methodologies on figuring out, how many people were they reaching out to, the demographics of those sources within stories and all that. That audit actually just concluded, I think in February of this year. But between that time where the audit was happening and up until February, the organizations and really the coalition that I'm working with called the Shift the Narrative Coalition, which is a coalition of 6 or 7 different community organizations that are part of this transformation work in media, we had been consistently engaging with Inquirer leadership to talk about the myriad of issues that were displayed because of that headline, but to also drill down and say, as you are kind of reflecting on your racism, as you're trying to transform yourself internally so that something like this never happens again, we proposed a list of common sense solutions and ideas that we think could be implemented very easily, and one that would be able to help address their issues of racism, bias, et cetera, within the newsroom. And as those conversations were happening, the Inquirer was also receiving more messaging and encouragement to really start listening and start collaborating and connecting with community organizations and people with lived experiences to actually talk about the systemic issues that they consistently see within coverage around crime, police, and the criminal legal system. And so when the Temple University audit came out in February, we were actually pointed to as a potential solution that can help not only build trust and better relationships between their journalists who are covering police and the people who are impacted by police violence, but how community engagement is a necessity. Really, community engagement with Black and Brown communities is a necessity if we are really going to change how these narratives are actually told and through the lens in which they are told. Not only that, but the solutions that are coming from grassroots-led efforts, how is that amplified and elevated within stories around police and the criminal legal system? And so just within the last couple of months, we've been able to work with the Inquirer in forming a community engagement partnership, as you could probably call it, where we're basically hosting community listening sessions where journalists who are covering crime and police, which I think is about a team of 6 or 7, are actively and actually working to listen and talk about ongoing coverage issues that community members have been seeing, not just even recently, dating back well before the Buildings Matter 2 headline. This is talking about generational harm, generational impact, and really trying to address and assess ongoing issues that we continuously see within their reporting. So over the course of a couple of weeks, we're going to be listening to journalists to say, how are they trying to change their reporting and their coverage around police and the criminal legal system? What are they missing? What do they need to improve and change their framework? And on the community aspect, what are the vital information needs that we're not consistently seeing in this type of coverage? And what are some of the ways that we can help elevate the people who really should be centered in these conversations so that the broader public cannot just be distorted by the information from police, but can actually gain a little bit more clarity from community-led solutions that address public safety? Because as we've seen in Philly, there's a lot of conversation around police not doing their jobs, really not protecting Black lives or supporting Black neighborhoods or really making our lives any better. what are the actual resources and solutions that we should be investing in that meet the needs of people who are impacted by gun violence, police violence, poverty, and the criminal legal system.
Wow, thank you so much, Tauhid. You know, I just was reminded of an excellent piece you and our colleague Mike Rispoli penned for Neiman Lab on the idea of defunding the crime beat, and really disrupting, in the ways you've described, the ways that criminal legal stories and public safety stories are reported. And I thank you for that work, because it is so powerful. And I want to give folks a preview that you also have some big ideas around this idea of, we've traditionally called a public editor, but I heard that you are cranking on reimagining and re-envisioning that. And I hope you'll come back to Free Press Live to tell us more about what you're dreaming in that regard.
You know I will.
Thank you so much, Tauhid. I do want to invite people who are watching to join us in the comments. Let us know what you think. This is Free Press Live, which you can tune into every Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern via facebook.com/free press. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. And today we're talking about media's historic role in the perpetuation of anti-Black racism. Tauhid Chappell has just joined us talking about some of the work that's happening at the Philadelphia Inquirer, at the urging of communities and advocates within that organization. But we know that the Philadelphia Inquirer is not the only organization that faced some big questions last year, before last year, and is continuing to face questions. But particularly in 2020, we saw reckonings, as they're being called, at the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, NPR, CBS, and beyond. We are seeing podcast companies, social media platforms face really strong calls from the community, from Black organizers, from social justice organizers, to stop the spread of disinformation and hate, and to change the way they do business. And I think that what's striking to me about what you just shared, Tauhid, is that you're not talking about diversity and inclusion. I don't think we're saying it's a bad thing. Certainly we believe in inclusiveness and having representation, but we also know that conditions have to change within these organizations if justice is going to be realized. And then that means redistributing power. And as you talked about, engaging with communities. Tia Oso, when I think of community, I think of you. So I want to ask you, you know, with all these organizations facing these internal calls for change, as well as calls from community, what is the media reckoning that needs to happen for the Black community in these times?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that, you know, what we saw and what we're seeing is like these ripples and these waves around addressing anti-Blackness and addressing structural and systemic racism. What I think is really important is that, especially when it comes to the media, you know, people want to report on the issue, and then you have the people who are within the organization or within the community saying, well, what about your racism? You want to talk about the racism that's happening over there or out there, but you're being racist. Your practices are racist. Your hiring practices are racist. The way that you're covering our communities are racist. And so I think that the reckoning both from within and without really looks like accountability and addressing these issues. It does look like breaking up power. A lot of our media companies and even like things that we look at as local media are actually owned by corporate structures and entities that have a profit motive, and they are led by, you know, rich white men that are completely disconnected from Black people and Black communities. And even a lot of Black leadership within media is also not accountable to community members or community leaders because of the way that the industry is focused and what it takes to be profitable and make money in the industry. And also, frankly, what is, you know, palatable and comfortable for people. And so what the reckoning looks like is being comfortable with getting uncomfortable. It looks like looking at restructuring. Some things need to be, you know, maybe broken up. Maybe the profit and business structures of these organizations need to be, you know, revolutionized and refocused. It also looks a lot like listening to the communities and giving them a seat at the table when it comes to power and governance, and when it comes to actually shaping an institution that's supposed to be and that is serving its audience. It really looks like being really serious about that and not just kind of, you know, we see you, we hear you and we're going to do better. It looks like actually really doing better. It really looks like, sharing power. And it also really looks like being honest about where you've been so that you can move, so that we can move forward better together. And these things I really am clear that these are things that are going to take a long time. It's not going to change overnight, but we also need to be really clear that concrete change is what's necessary to happen. And I think that what's really interesting is that Black issues are really popular as far as like a headline fodder. And Black users and Black conversations, on social media, are really, the drivers of audiences and viewership. And us not being the topic or the subject, but us being the people who are, directing, us being the people who are advancing the narrative is the reckoning in and of itself. We're not just something for you to study or talk about. We're actually, real human people, right? And we really are the ones who need to be in the leadership position for real change to take place and to take hold and for it to happen the way that it needs to.
Absolutely. Whew. I agree, Tauhid. I think we had the opportunity. You're reminding me of a conversation we had during Black History Month in February with Malkia Devich Cyril. Shout out to Mac of Media Justice.
Mac.
Yes, who just mentioned, media portrayals of us as subhuman or super predators, and then also as superhuman, in which some people even think of as somehow positive, as super athletes, if you will, or things. But in all of those, we are not necessarily understood to be human. And I think that as you're talking about changing the structure of the media system, as well as changing the ways that we engage and understand community, so that there is that nuance and contextualization of our humanity, that does feel like that's the reckoning I want to see. I'll put it that way.
That is the reckoning. That is it. Even I was thinking about here in Arizona, one of the things that I noticed about the coverage after George Floyd was that there's a lot of emphasis on like Black-owned businesses. And I'm like, this is cute. And Phoenix PD is one of the deadliest police forces in the nation. So why is it that you want to have this list of 28 Black-owned businesses when you need to be looking at, what is the list of the Black people that Phoenix PD killed this year? Why is it that you want to shift this narrative around like, oh, we're very pro-Black, we're going to feature these Black businesses, but you are not actually addressing what the actual problem is. We're not in the streets just because, Black businesses aren't getting the shine that they need.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Tauhid?
Oh my goodness. Power redistribution. I think once the whole corporate profit model is upended, maybe news from, commercial nonprofit media will actually start serving the public, aka Black and brown communities. But until that profit-driven model is completely upended, I'm worried and skeptical that we'll see these institutions make the transformative change that needs to happen in the way that we need it to happen. When we talk about power redistribution too, let's be honest, people need to be let go. There are people who are within these media institutions that have been complicit, that have been upholding white supremacist values, and they have continued to be there. And no amount of diversity, equity, inclusion training is going to remove people who have consistently kept barriers up that continuously harm and hurt the journalists of color and the Black journalists who are trying to tell these stories, because there is internally that internal strife and that internal tension of trying to tell these stories, but internally having these barriers. And so when we're talking about power redistribution, there has to be people up and down the decision-making chain that if they have not been a part of transforming or changing or moving the conversations, they need to be let go. Simple as that. And if these institutions are not doing active community engagement, active community listening, bringing in community members, particularly people with lived experience, to the table to talk about how can we change and actually improve our work, then they're not going to actually change anything. The cycle of harm is going to continue. So we need to have a fundamental, just completely transformative change from the business model to the personnel if we're really going to see some of these dreams realized. And as these institutions take forever to make these changes, because again, the Kerner Commission came out decades ago. It's not like we didn't know about this before, right? The slowness of this has really, I think, in my opinion, only justified the reason why we need to be empowering our community members to tell their own stories, tell their own narratives, take back these narratives, intervene from these narratives, complicate the narratives, and do it ourselves, because these institutions have been dragging their feet for too long. And it shouldn't be a man who's murdered in broad daylight for them to suddenly realize, oh, maybe we should actually be focusing on Black issues. Because, like Tia mentioned, focusing on Black businesses is cute, but that's not really the thing that's going to really bring us to where we need to be.
That's right. It's truly an issue of state violence and media complicity with that state violence from its very beginning. So I want to invite folks who are listening to this conversation to visit media2070.org and read the Media 2070 essay, which does touch on the Kerner Report 1968, which Tauhid just mentioned, as well as the Chicago Race Relations Commission report in 1919, which found at that time, similar to the Kerner Report, that media had played an integral role in racial violence in that place, in Chicago with the Chicago race riots, and in the anti-Blackness of that time, 1919, y'all. So it's 2021, and we are looking to, at last, address the role of media in anti-Black state violence. And I feel confident we'll get there long before 2070 in terms of that transformation, because of people like Tia Oso and Tauhid Chappell. Also want to shout out Diamante Ortiz in the comments.
Demo!
And so many others working in communities to not only hold media institutions accountable, but to hold our federal government, our FCC, and all of the halls of policy that are involved in shaping the structure of our media system, to hold them all accountable. So you can read about historic examples of harm, as well as activism in the ways that Black media and the Black press have always fought back and given voice to Black lives. Thank y'all for joining today in this conversation, Tauhid and Tia. I'm so grateful.
Thank you for having me, Colette. Always good to see your face and hear your voice and experience your brilliance. And same with you, Tauhid.
Thank you for having me, Colette, and likewise to you, Tia. To be in this space talking with you is an honor. So I appreciate you and all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And I just want to also invite folks to follow Free Press on Twitter at Free Press. We'll be continuing to watch developments in the Supreme Court decision, as well as holding accountable YouTube and Facebook and other social media platforms for the rise of racist disinformation, and working through the Media 2070 project to dream up media reparations. So please follow Free Press, as well as Media 2070 on Twitter, and these brilliant guests from today. And we will see you back here on Wednesday, May 7th, for the next episode of Free Press Live. We will be on hiatus for a little bit, but we'll be back and even better on May 7th. And we'll see you then at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. So thank you for tuning in to Free Press Live. We'll see you next time.